record on this. Ta-da! So welcome to the first REFEDS community chat. What I'm hoping to get out of these series of meetings is an opportunity for people to informally discuss some of the things that REFEDS is working on or is interested in. They don't have to be items specifically from working groups or anything, but if there are topics that we want to dive into and just talk about, that's what this series is for. The first 30 minutes or so will be a presentation on whatever topic we choose. In this case, it will be baseline. And then it'll be a 30-minute just informal chat, Q&A discussion about what you heard, what you want to know more about, some ideas, however it goes is okay. We'll be doing these every few weeks because we have a lot of topics queued up. And my hope is that that will also give us a much richer experience when we actually have the REFEDS meeting at TNC, because rather than trying to get all of these updates at that one time, we'll have a much richer set of information to work from as we get together and meet in person, should you be able to attend, or even remotely if you join us online. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Paul and Alan to talk to us about the baseline specification.
So Alan, please go ahead and share the presentation. You are muted.
That will make things complicated.
That's fine. I knew I was muted. I'm trying to find the right screen to share. Land of 2 billion tabs.
Will we be there in a minute or 90? No, a minute.
Nice teething problems. Zoom isn't allowing me to share my screen right now.
Oh, I will fix that.
Everybody should be able to.
Yeah, my Zoom client isn't allowing me to share my screen due to some conflict.
Paul, do you have a copy of the presentation?
Yeah, I have it. Yes, you need to share it. So, do you see my screen?
We do.
Yes.
Perfect. So, welcome to a chat about REFEDS Baseline and an overview. We are starting with that. Let's see if I can change. So, first of all, let's introduce me and Alan. Me, myself, and I is Paul Axelsson, working at Sunet with Swamid, and done Federation stuff since 2006. And I'm maybe too active in different working groups or in REFEDS. Alan?
Hello, and Alan Buxey, currently at my uni days. I'm a member of the Education Scheme Editorial Board and various REFEDS working groups. There's several people on the call that I can see on my screen ahead of me are too. And I've been active in the Federation space, EduRoam, etc. for many years, about 14 years at campus level, but just under a decade looking after EduRoam at the UK national level, and 5 years of now being in a commercial global service provider. And if you want to reach out to either of us, then we're on the EduGain Slack.
And there is also a baseline Slack channel still active. So the purpose of the baseline expectation is very simply to provide a baseline for enhanced trust within our federated world, to make it more streamlined or not, depending on how you see baseline. It's more about trust than anything else. It's also about trying to make collaboration with federations more predictable, so that if we are lucky, baseline means that the service get the attributes they need and other stuff. And also try to get federation relevant strategics into research and education and continue that growth. Because if we are not doing value work with federations, it will be more and more, we will be sidestepped. So we need to pick up our work and have a baseline, do all the other stuff. So the baseline explanations are very simple, a large set of very high level statements. And what those high level statements means will evolve over time based on what we are going through in the federation world by itself. And even we maybe need to update baseline in a couple of years or 5 also, because we have come further. Every federation or interfederation needs to define their own implementation of baseline. And that is because you have cultural, regulatory, technical, and economic differences. But we want to achieve the same goals and outcomes of this. We need to be very, very open to that. How you reach baseline is not the same in every federation. It may be very different, but the baseline should be able to reach for all of us. So, Alan, your turn.
Okay, so I'm going to go through those high-level statements that are in the baseline, and there's 3 sections. There's the expectations on identity providers, there's expectations on service providers, and then there's expectations on federations. So in the order that they appear as those sections within the baseline, we do identity providers first. So the first expectation, IPO1, is that your identity provider is operated with organization level authority. Now, for a lot of federations, this is already part of the process for registration within the federation within that region. IPO2 is your identity provider is trusted enough to be used to access your organization's own systems. So this is where the idea for in REFEDS assurance framework with local enterprise, this can help with these expectations. The interesting part when people say, oh, but we don't have any internal systems that are federated, is if you did have, then you would be happy to use this system to access those resources. Next slide, please, Paul. Part 2 for identity providers. IPO3, you publish contact information for your identity provider and respond in a timely fashion to operational issues. IPO4, you apply security practices to protect user information, safeguard transaction integrity, and ensure timely instant response. And IPO5 is you ensure the metadata registered in your federation is complete, accurate, and up to date. So certain specifications like REFEDS Certify can help with IPO3 and IPO4, and the EduGain sample profile may help you with IPO5. So these are the top level, high level expectations on identity providers, and the identity providers will need to make sure that they match these expectations. Moving on to the service providers, SPO1, you ensure that controls are in place to protect user privacy in the service that you operate. And SPO2 is you do not share information received from identity providers with third parties without relevant notification, and the information is stored only whilst necessary for operational purposes. And SPO6, we've put SPO6 in line straight after 1 and 2 in this presentation, out of order compared to what it's like in the baseline, because it covers the same kind of service space. Is you publish requirements for any user information required to access your service and ensure these requirements are appropriate and respect privacy. In terms of some of the expectations on this slide, regional regulations, etc., such as GDPR, will already be enforcing these things anyway. So for a lot of people, these expectations are the norm. In terms of specifications we have, the REFEDS NC categories can help with these expectations as well. So we'll note any of these REFEDS standards and specifications that will help with the adoption of the baseline. And if we look at the further expectations, SPO3, you publish contact information, respond in a timely fashion to operational issues. SPO4, you apply security practices to protect user information, safeguard transaction integrity, and ensure timely instant response. And SPO5, you ensure the metadata registered in Federation is complete, accurate, and up to date. That's the SB's same stance as IDPs in terms of making sure that that data is complete and accurate. And once again, REFEDS Certify can help with SPO3 and 04, and the EduGain SAML profile may help with SPO5. So none of these expectations go any deeper in terms of operational things. These are all high-level statements for the expectations on the service providers. If we now look at expectations on Federation operators, FO1, you focus on the trustworthiness of Federation as a primary objective and are transparent about such efforts. This goes on to the first slide that Paul said about the reason for the baseline existence is to build up this foundation of trust. And FO2, you publish contact information and respond in a timely fashion to operational issues. EduGain membership procedures may actually help with these expectations. Domestic stuff going on in the background. Part 2, FO3, you apply security practices to Federation operations and ensure timely instant response. And FO4, you follow good practices to ensure authentic, accurate, and interoperable metadata to enable secure and trustworthy federated transactions. So on this slide, the EduGain Instant Response Handbook may help with FO3. So these are resources that are already available to allow people to align themselves to baseline and work out how they're going to do it within their federation. And the EduGain SAML profile may help with FO4. And finally, part 3 of expectations on federation operators. FO5, you implement and support frameworks that improve trustworthy and scalable use of federation and promote their adoption by members and other participants. And FO6, you collaborate with other organizations to promote realization of baseline expectations nationally and internationally. So if you support the REFEDS specifications, your federation will be fulfilling FO5. And finally, the first rule of baseline is that you talk about baseline fulfills FO6. So one of the ideas is if you're implementing it and working on baseline, you make sure the rest of the world knows that you're doing such things to propagate the baseline through the system. If there's any questions about any of these expectations, we'll be doing a Q&A at the end of this presentation.
So this is a very fast presentation of all the things or requirements in baseline expectations. As you see, it's very, very high level. It's not going into any details at all. And that is intentional. So the current status is that REFEDS Baseline Expectation is a published REFEDS specification since, I think, late 2020. You may want to correct me on that. So it's there, it's open to use, and so on. Within EduGain, I've been looking for what happens now in different parts. I know and Ellen know about there is an initiative in EduGain that's called EduGain Future Working Group that is looking at how to recommend the use of baseline expectations to EduGain steering group and how to go further with that. And I hope that will make EduGain get up a notch here on baseline. InCommon has defined their own baseline expectations, and we did most of the work based on what they did in their baseline version 1, and they have gone to next version 2, and it's in the next iteration continuously. I know of my own federation, we are looking into how to do this, but we haven't decided yet exactly how, so I cannot say anything here for that. And I hope other federations is at the same level here. So next steps for every federation is to define your own implementation of baseline expectations. That is something I hope people will put in question and discussions here today after we are closing down this presentation. So there we are. We did a very fast presentation in 15 minutes, Heather, not 30 minutes. So please go ahead, Heather.
I do. I have a question.
Yeah.
So
The floor is open.
turn on my video. So if the different sites can implement this however they feel they need to, I understand the goal of increasing trust, but I would think that the point of increasing trust is to increase the ability to interoperate between the federations and within federations. And yet if groups implement it in different ways, does that challenge the possibility of cleaner interoperability?
I hope not. Because we are trying to, as you see, we try to put that into REFEDS perspective. We try to put it into Edigain's perspective. But I think the most important part is that federations are looking at each other and see what they are doing baseline. And me as a federation operator, I want to describe how we fulfill baseline expectations from our perspective. Open so everyone can look at it. That should not be any secret at all. That is what Internet 2 has done, in common done. They are really, really good at showing up what their baseline is. And that's good.
Yeah, I'd agree with Paul. If you look at it, on the technical level, every federation can implement a SAML federation as they feel like it, whether that's mesh, partial mesh, hub and spoke, etc. In terms of the baseline, we're not going to prescribe the implementation because how you do it is down to you as a federation, so long as the end result meets the expectations that are defined within baseline.
Do federations tend to have bilateral trust arrangements from one federation to another these days? Does that happen?
I know that we don't have any anymore. We had with the UK Fed for early days.
Mm-hmm.
Our things go through in Edigain and other local interfederations now.
Then the most useful form of baseline would be as a criteria for Edugain to say you have to meet this baseline to be in Edugain. Is that a correct statement?
That is possibly one way to enforce that the baseline is adopted. That's not how the baseline would be implemented, though, within the federations. However, for interfederation baseline, if Edugain were to say that you must meet this baseline before being a member, then that could be one way of doing it. Edugain Futures Working Group may have that actually on their charters, something to put into place at some level. But then you still have the issue of what happens when you want to migrate to another baseline. So there would be a transitory period where you would have baseline and non-baselines, and then moving after that you'd have baseline, enhanced baseline, whatever you want to call it, version 2 versus the original baseline. So there would be some problems there with when people have migrated. That said, you don't need to be interfederated to match the baseline. For example, I'd say if you were a new federation and you were looking at joining Edugain, you'd probably want to be baseline maybe before joining in the future, be up to speed, rather than think now we're trying to join Edugain, then we want to meet these criteria. It's actually criteria that you can meet before you've interfederated.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, continue, Morgan.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I could see your point. You were asking about sort of maybe differences in the way that baseline expectations was implemented between federations. But I wonder if you had an example in mind of, two different ways it would be implemented that might conflict. I don't know if that's exactly what you were saying, but might cause problems or.
Yeah, I don't have an example. I can just, as soon as you say you can implement it however you like, I immediately question what that just feels fraught with peril. I don't know that it is. It just
the end product can be measured the expectations can be checked against, and the Federation, the IDP operators, the SP operators all have to assert that they meet these expectations.
And the final goal is both enhanced trust and interoperability. And that interoperability part, that is what Edugain can help with from the beginning. The other way, enhanced trust, is more that the organization or behind the federation define how they meet the criteria, and then everyone can look at that and see if that is that good enough. So there is a bit of openness, as you say, Heather, and it's very, very intentional.
Do I don't mean to be owning all the questions. I just had a bunch. Other folks, questions, comments? Feel free to raise your hands or chime in.
I actually had a kind of a random thought, as there was the expectation that the IDP, or I guess the IDP side of that, is operated with, well, not organizational level authority, but there was one about sort of trusted for use by the organization's own systems. I think you guys covered that. And I was just thinking to myself, here at OSU, we're gonna sort of switch all our internal stuff from SHIB to Azure SSO, and then be using, maybe Cirrus Bridge or something like that to sort of gateway into the Uncommon Federation and stuff. And it just occurred to me, like, well, does that mean we actually don't trust our shibboleth stuff enough for our own systems? Or in those models where we've decided, like, well, we're not using the Federation product, we're not using it for our internal stuff anymore. We're using this other identity provider product. I suppose that's up for us to kind of weigh whether we think we're meeting that expectation correctly or not. But not that I'm happy about this particular change, to be clear. But
okay, yeah. So one thing is, would you use your shibboleth instance, for internal systems if you didn't have a direct, some diktat saying you have to use this Azure instead? And the second one is the backend identity, because the identity provider is like the whole ecosystem of the identity management. So is your shibboleth still talking to the same backend systems, or is it talking to a separate database, etc.? So
yeah, and I think that's
not
the
talking about
point
the
here.
technical level. This is why we can't really go in. We don't want to go into the low-level details, and it's a high-level thing. Is because once you start breaking this down, it's like, well, what do you mean by, accessing your own systems? What do you mean by the identity provider? And the whole thing becomes a big open autopsy of how people operate.
Yeah, and so I think actually the answer is yes, it's still true, but because whatever we're if we're doing the Cirrus Bridge or whatever instance of shibboleth we're running, it's really just delegating authentication, proxying back to Azure SSO. So fundamentally we're still using the system that we use internally and stuff. So or will be someday, I guess.
I think you will use the same attribute store also, more or less.
Yeah, from the identity management side, that's all common, of course. It's not like some separate identity management system just for the federated stuff. So yeah.
Other questions? Okay, then I can ask my next one. So now putting like Internet 2 a little bit on the spot here. So they've got the baseline expectations 2, and I think there's groups that are already looking ahead to 3, and maybe even 4 is a glint in somebody's eye. I'm not really sure. How do you think the REFEDS Baseline Working Group? I mean, it's essentially shut down because it's produced the thing. But does it need to spin back up? Are you going to try and stay in alignment with Internet 2 stuff? Do you think you've gone as far as you need to, given the global state of federation and the different levels of maturity? What you going to do next?
Paul, do you want to answer, or shall I answer? I mean, first of all,
No,
we'd like to
this
see the current
this should
baseline adopted by other
yeah.
federations to see that the work is worthwhile, etc. The second part would be the working group actually did have a proviso in it of respinning up if necessary to identify the current landscape and see what was needed for improving trust in federations going forwards. And therefore that would spin up, ideally at spin up, have participants would do the gap analysis and see which parts of baseline needs to be improved, much like the in common process has done to identify what they're going to add into their next baseline.
And Tom, you are part of this, have been part of the working group that, or group in, not working group in common that does this work. Do you have any comments on that?
I suppose so. I think about, there's another way to, an additional way to view baseline expectations, and that is it's a framework for managing change, which is kind of underlying when we talk about interoperability and trust, kind of mean, well, we ought to be able to implement changes up to a baseline at least, so that those things that are trustworthy and valuable really are ubiquitously expressed and not kind of problematically expressed in federation. So I'm always on about the processes. I've noted in the conversation so far a couple of places where this might come up, where there's sort of a notion where maybe edugating, for example, might check. It might be a requirement, a prerequisite. And how would they know? Well, there's a process there. Or if we talked about transition, but if the things migrate a bit, there's going to be, that's a process. It's a change. And so I think that there's several ways that we might, as a working group, recognize things that need to change in time with some rate in order to perpetuate adherence to baseline expectations. And so that's what those points are, what processes might be available to respond to them, to implement them, could be a good area for the working group to look into. Maybe not to specify for all federations and all circumstances the set of allowable processes they can choose from that may be going too far. But there may be some things that are extra federation, or some suggestions and hints and so forth, ideas to prepare for specific federations too for their implementations. And in common, of course, has several such processes. It's got this community consensus process. That's how we go about determining if there's going to be a version 3 and what's going to be in it, if so, and when. There's a dispute resolution process, which is not specific to baseline, but if anyone feels that some party or other isn't really fully meeting their obligations under baseline, there's a way to pursue that concern and get it resolved, that kind of stuff. You could also pick on Brett here. I've seen he's sitting there being quite quiet. Look at the chart he's got behind him. I recognize that. I think that's probably intentional.
This is this is the process, Tom. Yeah, this is the dispute resolution process diagram. I was going to just plus one, Tom, that this has been a significant exercise in change management and establishing the processes and getting every member of the Federation understanding that change must occur, and how will we do that collectively that was the biggest hurdle that we had to overcome, I think. And now that we have some of it established, it is kind of exciting to see and kind of sit back and watch as, folks like Andy, who's here, and some others continue on and continue evolving that baseline expectations. But it has been really about establishing a change management process for making sure that we can continue to evolve, because we know we need to. Yeah.
A quick comment before I see my next meeting started. One of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons there was a version 2 of baseline expectations is the impression I got was that, after deploying version 1, we realized that there was, 1 or 2 things that we missed actually, that were, just through nobody's fault or whatever, just oversight or whatever. And Tom's fault. Yeah, it's definitely Tom's fault. And I think, that may be the case for version 3 at some point, as you kind of roll these things out and just look at it, it's not necessarily that we're trying to move the move the goalpost or something. It's actually more about like, yeah, but here's another thing that's important, that we missed in some detail.
Yeah, I'm going to break that down a little bit. I think that's actually right. So first of all, there was a bug in the original uncommon baseline expectations, the high level statements. I missed something and then we kept on. A lot of us missed it, but I missed it to begin with. But also this difference between baseline V1 and baseline V2 and in common is not all about, it doesn't mean that the high level statements changed except to fix a bug. They effectively didn't change at all. What was updated was the description of what kinds of campus level, participant level implementations will suffice to meet these high level, to address those high level statements. And so imbuing greater clarity and specificity about implementation for members of InCommon. So that's a little different. And that's something I would expect would be a key part of when Paul and Alan talk about the different federations, their own implementations of baseline. It's going to look a lot more like that, I think. What can you use for security or anything else may vary a little bit in your country or your jurisdiction, but the point should still be that you have good security practices, reasonable incident response, and that kind of stuff as an expectation, however it's done.
So I have a question for all of you. Somewhere on, you can think about it and open the mic later, but do you, in your federation, have you started to think about how to do baseline expectation in your federation? That's a really good question. Or if you don't, do you think you will do it in the near future or not? And that we can take after a couple of other questions. So Heather, I think you have more.
I think I got the worst of mine out at this point, trying to understand how guidance like this can actually move trust ahead if everyone can implement it in different ways. I feel like someone then needs to evaluate, did those ways work or not? I don't recall if there's any kind of FAQ or best practice guidance saying, yes, you can do this in a lot of different ways, but here are some that we know work really well. Or if that's even a direction to go in.
So far, the only project that we're aware of is obviously InCommons. So we've got the learning experience from InCommon and how they did things. I would probably recommend that federations read the InCommon baseline docs and see how they worked and see how that needs to be tailored for your own audience and what you need to do locally. Obviously, if you've got different technology stacks, you may need to do things differently or can ignore certain things because you can control everything centrally anyway. One of the things mentioned, I mean, we've already heard that it was a big change management program, and change management needs to be taken into account. But the other aspect is, whilst the high level expectations, you read them and think, oh, okay, most of them are pretty much self-explanatory. It's the sort of like an iceberg, there's 80% hidden underneath that water level, which is things like customer relationship management. It's your contact details. I know that InCommon spent a lot of resources getting their contact details up to date to be able to get baseline V1 across the line. And it's that kind of workload rather than some sort of SAML technology stuff that a lot of the federations will need to be spending a lot of their time and effort on.
And furthermore, I think that whatever Edgame comes forward with will steer what baseline is in the future. So that means that everyone in this room that is part of Edgame some way or another have a say on that. And as usual, the only one that can do something the hard way, that means disconnect things that doesn't work, is federations and the interfederation.
Makes sense. Do other folks have questions, comments, random
Or an answer
ideas?
to Paul's question.
An answer to Paul's question? Alex.
Yeah, I could give a partial answer to Paul's question about whether other federations have considered this. And the UK Federation has considered the high level baselines. for some of them, you know, as you kind of covered in as you were introducing the baselines, a lot of those are already covered by part of our rules of membership and the joining stuff. But in terms of metadata, we've got a large federation that's very heterogeneous, and the kind of complete and accurate is we're trying to think about that in terms of fit for purpose, and is it more complete or things that are then sent to EDUGAIN and interfederated. So we spent a bit of time looking at not so much a baseline, like we were calling it like an export guarantee baseline, essentially saying that things that we exported to EDUGAIN would have a certain amount of things in there, which would have been a tighter definition than things we use internally within the UK Federation itself, because we have, I think it's like 20 or 25% of the entities registered are only within the UK Federation, and then maybe 75% are exported to EDUGAIN. And that was an interesting exercise, just looking at the difference between, you know, what we would maybe need kind of domestically and what is into to EDUGAIN. And it was also useful in the sense that we realized that we have quite a low uptake of certain things like certify and security contacts and requested attributes, and a lot of things that you can test in metadata. So it was quite a learning experience, but we have thought about it and we need to get back to it, I think.
I really like that, Alex. Thinking about if you were to implement it, how could you phase it in, or how could you focus your efforts on maybe the most important entities first and then expand it? So one of the things I think, Heather, you mentioned earlier was, and maybe I am implying this here, you were asking about how do we actually measure success? And is that some of those items in the metadata, you can almost, you know, mechanically answer that question, whether or not we're meeting success. So underlying some of that is, are there some common ways that we can provide or recommend that federations measure their own success, or start a project where they focus their efforts on, as Alex kind of mentioned, focus just on those that are exported to EDUGAIN first. Maybe then you focus on just the IDPs. That may be another area of focus. And then SPs, you know, how can you actually scale this and measure your success? Within CTAB, we had a significant regular data and metrics that were provided. We actually had Slack updates getting posted, I think, daily when we were monitoring progress. And then eventually getting it down to a burn down list of the final few IDPs that we needed to reach out manually and contact. So sharing documents or sharing resources for tracking progress and measuring them, I think, might be helpful as well. Another thought that popped into my head was, could a tool like MET be able to report on some of these things and provide some periodic data points over time, so that collectively the communities can track their own progress towards meeting some of these things, where we have the ability to do simple mechanical checking of, do you include contact information? Are you using, you know, secured endpoints, those sort of things. But I really like that approach, Alex, of focusing on this, especially in the larger federations where you have a significant number of entities that may need changes. How can you focus your effort to make progress?
Editorial note, CTAB is in Commons Community Trust and Assurance Board. They're the ones that kind of guide in Commons Baseline Expectations program. Thanks.
And yeah, that's pretty much right where I was trying to get to, I think, in that self-assertion is fine for some things, but if what you're trying to do is build actual trust that things are being done in a manner to support the goals, self-assertion isn't enough. You have to actually be able to measure it some way, and that's where you get to for me the technical component of how do you measure the interoperability? How is this actually working? Being able to check, is there a contact address, is almost good enough. But it's even better if you say, is there a contact address and does it actually go anywhere? It's even better. Similar for the certified addresses and things like that. I mean, I love that those are the kinds of things that I would hope could be tested, in that, sure, it doesn't matter if you have a Federation Manager tool to add those contact addresses, everyone has them, and therefore you can actually verify. Trust but verify. I like that.
The standard problem with that is that if we are trying to do checks all around, people will go so spammed with checks that they don't answer them, and that will break down the trust.
Well, that's
So
why
the-
EduGain should just do it, right? It shouldn't be everybody checking on everybody else, because at this point we don't have bilateral agreements, say, between federations. So if EduGain does the check and it only comes, from the one entity, wouldn't that be better?
No, because
Damn.
I, as a Federation operator, will do my own checks.
And not
Yeah,
many
but
people
no-
on the EduGain support team speak Swedish, I think.
That's also correct. Or Italian. Italian is wrong.
Polish? What about Polish? No?
Maybe.
Hmm.
Yeah. So then it's more about policies and how you do stuff within the Federation, so that you can explain, for example, EduGain, that you fulfill this in a good way. And if the Federation wants to have EduGain's help, that's not a problem. That's really good.
Tom?
I wanted to have another kind of response to your let's measure, trust, but verify thing, which is fine. I have no problem with that. But I think there's also an additional component of trust that we really should recognize, because it's quite important here, which is that we're already, at least in the research and education community, willing to trust each other. Hard to say, hard for us to define precisely how far and for what, but there is something there. And towards that end, we find that if someone is made aware that, if they're asked and accept the responsibility to ensure that their IDP or their SP or whatever meets these statements, you generally find that people are quite sincere. They're authentic. They are part of this community, and when they say they're going to do a thing, they typically do. There can be extra circumstances that change that immediately or down the road sometimes, but that's change. So there's a lot to be said about having a contact that's live, with whom you can have an ongoing or episodic discussion about baseline in this case, and get their agreement. That's worth a lot. I think that many relying parties, part of their frustration may be when they don't hear that everyone has actually even agreed to a thing. There's a lot of, that's just not the case. They're far from that. So they know that it's hit or miss in terms of whatever property of federation that a relying party may be critical to them. And so it's helpful, even if it's not verifiable in terms of value, if they all say, yes, we do this thing. It's something that you can take to the bank in our ineffable way, the bank of trust, as it were, in R&E. So I think that's actually really important to not lose sight of. It's a key element that makes all of our stuff go.
I don't know. I feel like I need to channel Leif Johansson a little bit. And I think all of you know Leif, and all of you have probably heard Leif start to go off on some of his lectures. So I'm just going to cue them. Pause for a moment. You can play them in your head. Trust is local, and trust doesn't scale. Okay, now you've got those in your head. I think that would be a point to consider as well.
Yeah, of course it is so. That's why trust is within the Federation and between federations and interfederation, because that is local and a little bit less local, but it's very small groups anyway. Not maybe for Incommon and UK Fed, but for the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the expectations on identity providers, your identity providers operated with organizational level authority. Well, someone from the other side of the world won't know that. Your federation hopefully has registration practices that make sure that that is the case. And then likewise, your identity provider is trusted enough to be used to access your own organization's systems. Well, that's a self-assertion made by the identity provider operator. And ideally, there's enough trust layered already at that point that there isn't something interesting going on. However, those two ones are then encapsulated within, for example, the metadata registration practices statement that is submitted to Edugain for when a federation joins, and every federation has a chance of reading other federations' statements and seeing how they operate to make sure that there is that level of trust and uniformity across the system. But related to the current baseline, at this point, this baseline is the foundation, it's the first building block, because once this is in place, then you can start to layer on other expectations, which is what In Common are doing with, baseline V2, etc. We need everyone on a certain level playing field, before we can start expecting everything else to be uniform.
And even go deeper.
Mhm.
So does anyone else has a comment about what your federation is thinking about or not thinking about? Chris normally talks a lot, so it's very quiet today.
Calling me out, Paul.
Yeah, of course I do.
I apologize for missing the first half, so I'm flying a little bit blind on that regard.
Yeah, the first half was more or less a presentation of baseline, the bullet points. So you didn't miss so much because you have been there in the work.
Yeah. So we're spending a tremendous amount of energy on making sure people are current, and to live up to some of those self-asserted expectations of certify. So I'd be very interested on how other federations are shepherding their federations in that endeavor, knowing that Internet 2's baseline expectations has everyone and every entity that's an IDP in common is tagged certified by default. As I understand it, per I think CI logon, it has that expectation. And so with coming updates to software, there's an interesting dynamic there. And Tom, you mentioned the trust and the locality and having people, everyone wants to do the right thing. It starts becoming an interesting question of at what point in time does that sort of, you bend a little bit, it's too much. What's the right level of thing in that trust equation and baseline with staying current? That's a question to anyone on the call. That's a question to anyone.
Well, I mean, in a sense, that's the purpose of the community consensus process I referred to. So it's not just a couple of individuals, but there's some group, in this case, In Common CTAB, that kind of drives that, puts out, gathers information, does online office hours, blah, blah, lots of engagement, and finally goes through a process to try to get the community's input. Where does the community want to be next? It's all oriented towards that. And so it doesn't go farther than that. I don't know if that really addresses any of your questions.
Related to software as well, it also depends upon what the reason for the new major release is. If the issue with the software release is security, then you run the latest thing. But if the latest release that's come out is feature driven and there's no security issue and you don't need to use those new features, then it's okay being on the previous release so long as it's maintained and it's the secure version of it.
Interesting, like all the software that we have, insert all the things here, run on existing operating system platforms. And so those come out with frequent security features, right? So Yum Update, apt-gets, and Windows Update, right? So the premise, the good hygiene of your ecosystem is the sum of all the parts together. Some places are not as clean as others, right? And that's the rolling dynamic of how do we maintain consistency, a good bracket. Because if we try to do it as a binary, decision on something, it's incredibly hard. Like, did you run apt-get update on your machine today? Well, if you didn't, you're not up to date. So should you still get certified tag? You know, oof.
How
What does that
recently-
mean?
this
Right?
comes back
You
to
know,
what
that-
Tom said about community consensus. So if you're happy
Yeah.
with, you know, the whatever day it's now, Patch Tuesdays with Microsoft once a month type timelines, or is this a major vulnerability like when Heartbleed came out, and this is a thing you need to fix within a very short space of time? You cannot leave this wide open. Then those are measured for each instant, I believe. You can't do this just globally because I know there's a bug with the underlying libxml that just is a bit annoying. Okay, that's one thing, but actually this now makes you wide open, you releasing and leaking data. Well, that's a big issue.
There's also, I mean, there's degrees. Baseline is the minimum requirement level. It's probably in most cases far from the best one could possibly do, right? And that's intentional. It's supposed to be a baseline. And so if you're not updating something immediately, well, that may still be okay. And in frameworks like Certify, there is wording around that. It steers away from giving a specific absolute periodicity and instead refers that to, you know, organizational risk management, because that's how it's going to get done anyway. As long as it's being done diligently, that's kind of the intention. The periodicity is kind of secondary. You're doing it as you can according to your own internal risk management decisions. So that's what the attestation, the self-attestation means, and doesn't mean anything more than that.
I'd like to revisit that point that Tom said, actually, this is a baseline, it's minimum expectations, it's not an aspirational target.
Yeah.
We're not asking people to reach some super high echelons of capabilities.
Well, it is
So-
aspirational for some.
Oh, yes.
Well, ideally, we're at a level where everyone can achieve this particular baseline.
Well, so I've been listening to everything that's gone on, and I appreciate all the discussion. I'm sort of interested to know at what point somebody might, you use the word diligence there, where due diligence means you have adhered to these minimum baselines, and here are the measurable ways, you know, following some checklist by which we're going to measure your adherence to it. I think that's going to vary greatly, but if we don't promote the minimum baseline and as a community assert that these are our minimum expectations, then things will never get better. So hopefully over time, this is just a matter of bringing the level up, and then strongly encouraging those who want to participate with us. Hey, you know, I'd like to work with you, but I need you to at least show me that you can, or in some way, you know, demonstrate that you're at least up to this entry level. And over time, maybe we'll increase that or make it more stringent in certain areas, or as you have GDPR in Europe and so on and so forth, there are some things that regulatory, you know, I can't work with you because my regulations, you know, have a higher standard, right? So it's certainly worthwhile effort. And while I'm not sure what you're hoping for in terms of community attestations beyond the ones that have already been set forth, like Certify and so forth, are there other areas where we need something that somebody can measure, if only for themselves, to say, okay, now I have some confidence that I am adhering? And where's that available?
Thanks, Eric. I think this is a really good question.
That's a great question.
Yeah, because what I heard you said, but it may not be what you said, is where do we need to bring forward and write new specifications and best practices and so on within our community? And that was a little bit what we were talking about when we did the baseline expectations, how to spin up new things within REFEDS to point out how we do stuff, how we do things better, and so on and so on.
I think what I'd love to do is most of you, probably all of you, are on the EduGain Slack channel. If you're not, reach out to me and I'll get you a darn link to it. There is a REFEDS channel within there. I would love to see this conversation continue to talk about where else do we need to set up some kind of guidance, specification, something potentially measurable, however you want to define measuring, because I think that's what REFEDS is about, and how we can support all the federations in the world to continue to grow and evolve and mature as they need to for their regions. With
And
that,
yeah, wait. And there is also the baseline channel within EduGain Slack that you can use. That was only what I want to say.
With that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. I want to thank you all for attending, for having rich conversations. That was glorious. I'm putting Julie on the spot so that we can do one of these about assurance. We may do another one about the browser changes. And goodness knows, we have as a community so much to talk about. So we'll be having these regularly, and I hope to see you at the next one.
See you all.